So I guess a good place to start would be just kind of if you could give a little bit of background as to your area and areas of expertise, and where you kind of see North Carolina's role in this election.
Okay. Well, I grew up in South Carolina in Clemson, and I've always been interested in politics, and particularly Southern politics. And for my master's, I did a study of the rise of the Republican Party in South Carolina in the 1960s, and decided I wanted to go on and get my PhD in political science and study particularly Southern politics, but some state level politics. Went to the University of Georgia and got my PhD there, and came to Catawba in 2002 and thought if I could just teach and maybe do a little bit of research on the side, I'd call it a happy career. And lo and behold, that fall was a major U.S. Senate race in this state, and had a TV station call me and ask if I could come down for election evening coverage, and lo and behold, here I am. So it's been a very fun ride. It's been something I've been able to use as kind of a service component and an educational component. So it certainly fits into my general philosophy of trying to help people understand politics. When it comes to North Carolina politics, being a Southerner and kind of a cousin, I guess, to say, from South Carolina to North Carolina, it's been an interesting study. Mostly Southern politics is about the solid Republican South, and particularly at the presidential level. The region has undergone kind of a transition from the 20th century into the 21st century. But for Republicans, if they can win the solid South, meaning sweep all of the states of the old Confederacy, they basically have a lock on the White House through the Electoral College. For Democrats, it's all about trying to crack the solid South. And states like Florida, a classic swing state, states like Virginia, that has become a kind of classic swing state. If Democrats can peel off at least 2 out of potentially 3 states that are in that region, it makes it a lot harder for Republicans to win and a lot easier for Democrats to win. And I think in looking at North Carolina in 2000 and 2004, George W. Bush won the state by 13 percentage points. So if anybody had said in 2008, well, will a Democrat win? I think they would have looked at them and said, what are you on, and can I get some, because you're obviously having a very good time about it. Well, it was Barack Obama. It was a ground game operation that I don't think anybody recognized until really it was too late. And he flipped a 13 percentage Republican state to a 0.4% Democratic state. And that's where we've been constantly. I think this is the new norm for North Carolina. It is a demographically changing kind of a state. And I think for a lot of us, this is going to be what we come to expect, how North Carolina is.
And you mentioned that 2008 presidential election year, and it was just so dramatic. I remember when it happened.
Yeah.
I mean, so many different pollsters had said it's going to be Romney, and then if you look at sort of this big data and actually analyze the poll, you would see that it would be Obama by that thin of a margin. What allowed Obama to gain so much power in the South particularly?
Well, in this state in particularly, it was Obama's ground game. He came in and looked at a state that really hadn't been contested. Now, in 2004, John Edwards was on the Democratic ticket, but everybody thought, even a North Carolinian is not going to help carry this state for John Kerry in 2004. I think what Obama's campaign did was he looked at all of the states and in particularly looked at voter rolls and said, are there Democrats who typically don't show up that we could target and get to show up in an election year like 2008? And so they focused on a ground game, they focused on data analytics, and in particularly they focused on early voting. If you look at the trends, right now North Carolina most likely will have 60% of all its ballots cast done before Election Day in a presidential year. And what Obama was doing was basically getting Democrats to vote early, bank those votes. You know, if you're a registered Democrat, you're probably going to vote Democratic 90 to 95% of the time. And so those are pretty reliable votes. And I think what Obama did was come in, look at the opportunity, and in particularly for young voters and African American voters, particularly in urban areas. He really focused a ground game that energized and mobilized a block of voters who may not traditionally have voted. He got them out. And the turnout among the partisan voters, typically registered Republicans tend to show up more than registered Democrats in this state. In 2008, registered Republicans were 70% voter turnout among their pool. Registered Democrats were 70% among their pool. That's where the difference was made. And then in 2012, even though he lost it by 2 percentage points, registered Democrats were at 71%, registered Republicans were at 73%. So I think that's where the new norm for North Carolina is. It's all about turnout.
And I'll get kind of more towards the different distinctions demographically in terms of old, young, where they're from, which counties. But you mentioned kind of the influence of millennials and the appeal made to younger voters.
Yes.
Where do you kind of see younger voters having an influence in the state, local, national races, particularly in 2016?
They could be a key component in terms of Hillary Clinton's coalition to recreate the Obama ground game. Now, the question is all about enthusiasm and energy, and I think that's where the real test is going to be. I'm not sure she's going to be able to replicate 2008 in this state, where a bunch of young voters did show up and had a huge influence. But even if she can get close and also convince suburban voters to maybe not be as supportive of the Republican nominee as they traditionally are in this state, she can make this state very competitive. And I think basically what you're looking at in terms of the polls in this state is a coin toss. It's pretty much a 45-45 split in this state. And very few undecideds. We're still a month out from the election. Granted, we'll start to see some real numbers come in terms of the in-person early voting in a couple of weeks. But I can't help but think that the polls have been fairly stable and probably indicate that this is going to be a down-to-the-wire kind of a race in North Carolina. And millennials, particularly voters under the age of 35, they're becoming much more of a force in North Carolina politics.
Why is that?
Well, part of it is just age. They're growing up.
Yeah, and
They're becoming.
People are just aging out. So
There's that. There's a generational shift going on in North Carolina. If you look at the voter registration pool, we've got about 6.7 million voters in North Carolina. And the numbers that I ran, about 34% of them are baby boomers. So those folks born between 1945 and 1965, okay? The next largest group are millennial voters, and those are voters born after 1981. They're about 29% of the voter registration pool. So by November, those two groups probably will be even in terms of their percentage. Now the question is going to be, do they show up? And we know that voters, as they age, as they become more mature, typically will tend to show up. But if they were introduced to politics early in their lives, 18, 20, 22 years old, and they identified with a party at that time, that party affiliation generally will tend to hold throughout their lives. And so this huge new wave of voters coming in got excited by Obama, got invested. Even though they are registering more and more unaffiliated, they tend to vote more Democratic than Republican. So I think we'll tend to see that trend hold, and that's going to be a seismic shift in this state once that kind of parity amongst baby boomers and millennials with Gen X kind of in the middle. Once that shift occurs, that's going to have a huge impact.
And just seems kind of impractical to expect Hillary Clinton to replicate 2008.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
anybody to replicate 2008 is going to be very difficult, if not
I would
impossible.
agree. Yep.
What do you think would cause a millennial? I know we're not going to focus on the policy issue, but what makes a millennial say, "I'm going to show up"? What makes a millennial say, "I'm sitting this one out"?
Well, I think
A lot of things,
that is the ultimate question. How can candidates tap into the issues and the concerns of that generation, which is a very different generation from any others that we've seen? Now, Gen Xers tend to be the bridge between the two. You can kind of look at survey data and say, yeah, okay, there's this transition going on in Gen Xers to millennials from baby boomers. I think that's a natural bridge.
But there's no natural bridge for the millennials.
Well, yeah.
Their own kind of deal.
They are very much a different kind of generation than the country has ever seen. First off, they are probably the most socially libertarian of all generations. You know, they don't have an issue with gay marriage. They don't have an issue, even evangelical millennials tend to favor gay marriage. I mean, that's just unheard of if you go to a baby boomer evangelical kind of voter. So I think that there is definitely a dynamic going on that we're still trying to understand about millennial voters, but generally they tend to lean Democratic, they tend to be more liberal in their ideology, and I think that they have been impacted so much by the Great Recession of 2008 that they see the potential for government intervention to be a good thing. Now, what they're experiencing is government gridlock. And the likelihood is that may start turning them off to say, well, I want these things, but is government the right venue by which to try and achieve them?
So it seems that the optimism just is dying out, to be...
Well, and to be frank, Obama tapped into that. He kind of launched that energy, launched that enthusiasm. It's all about hope. Yes, we can. And then Obama ran into the reality of our modern polarized politics in the Capitol. And I think that that's where the country is right now. We are so polarized. And I think millennials kind of thought we can break through that. And granted, idealism is great in youth, but the reality is what we're going to have to deal with for the next, in my estimation, long time in terms of the next polarized environment that we're living in.
So I guess just to kind of look at the other, we talked a little bit about age there, but in terms of geographic shifts, we've seen dramatic changes in North Carolina, and I remember talking with you and looking at Wake County, looking at Mecklenburg County, looking at Durham County, looking at Guilford County, looking at all these traditionally more divided states. I think it's fair to say they tended to be a little bit more Democrat leaning or more even-keeled.
Yeah.
Well, what's caused them to go from here, where we're dead even, to now we're very, very strongly in favor of Democrats? What caused that shift?
I think North Carolina urban areas just came to mirror what's going on in the country. What we tend to find is that urban dwellers want very specific and different things from rural dwellers and citizens. And I think that shift in North Carolina is, along with the generational change, this dynamic of urban versus rural is really becoming much more pronounced in North Carolina. And I think even more so than what we've seen in the past. You know, if you take all the urban counties in North Carolina, Barack Obama won those urban counties 55 to 45 on average. You take the suburban counties, Mitt Romney won those counties 62 to 38. So, and then in the rural counties, Romney won 54 to 46. So there are some very clear splits. There are very few kind of competitive areas that I would point to in North Carolina and say, yeah, that's kind of a swing county or kind of a swing precinct. People are just living in like-minded communities. We're sorting ourselves. And people who want that urban environment, who want the dynamics of an urban life, are trending Democratic. People who want the rural kind of life are trending much more Republican. And what's happening is those two communities can't really talk to one another because they only know people that are like them. All their friends act and think and vote like them, and then they meet somebody from the other area and they go, what's wrong with this person? I can't understand where they're coming from. Well, we've done it to ourselves. We have sorted ourselves into these like-minded communities, and we get the kind of polarized environment that we're experiencing.
Well, naturally, I suppose people will gravitate towards where they feel most comfortable.
Exactly.
So I guess
exactly.
the opportunity cost, then, just to paraphrase, is that they're not with people of different beliefs and ideologies because they're so entrenched in their own sort of objectives of where they see themselves.
Exactly. And I think that's true not just for communities and residency, but I think it's true for us individually, that we look at things through a partisan lens. And if some piece of information challenges a notion that we know is the way it should be, we will automatically discount it. But if we hear information that confirms what we already believe, well, it has to be true. And just look at this last presidential debate. I mean, the first presidential debate, it was pretty clear that Hillary Clinton was a very polished, prepared type of candidate. Donald Trump was being Donald Trump. I mean, he was basically winging it. Well, you look at the reactions from the partisans. Well, if I'm a Republican, Trump won. Well, if I'm a Democrat, Hillary won. And you can't really talk to either one of them because they won't acknowledge any faults or any concerns. They'll just say, yeah, my candidate won. Well, okay, that's where we are.
I had an interesting discussion with people about the debate, and it seemed that those who are undecided or those who are just, both candidates have high unfavorabilities, no question about that.
Complete, yeah.
So naturally, people are still in the decision of, do I show up? Do I vote which way?
Yep.
And it seemed that the undecided voters really didn't get much out of the experience.
Yeah, I watching that 90 minutes at the end, I thought to myself, if you're undecided and you're really trying to pick one of these candidates over the other, did tonight convince you one way or the other? And I don't think it did. I think both candidates were focused on their bases, maybe trying to reach a little bit into the middle, but really it's all about, if I can energize my base and get more of my reliable voters to show up, I don't necessarily need to win in the middle. I can play to my base, get more votes, reliable votes that way, and just kind of discount the folks that are in the middle. And we may want to wait for, they'll come.
Read my mind.
I'm praying that they keep going past campus, please.
Yay. Okay. Two of them.
Oh, that's not. I can usually tell if they slow down. Nope, they're gone. Okay, they're going by campus. Okay, good.
And that was Obama's 2008 strategy, not necessarily let me try and win over some undecideds. It was let me rock and pummel my opponent just by doing well in my own.
Yeah, I think
it's not about appealing. I just don't think that it's about appealing to middle ground. It's about mobilizing your existing support and getting those potential voters to be absolute voters.
Yeah, and I think you hit on one of the key terms, the opportunity cost of, if I know that you self-identify as one of the partisans, so you tell me you're a Democrat or a Republican. Well, by every study we know, I can pretty much predict that you're going to vote for your party 90 to 95% of the time. That's a reliable voter. I'm going to invest in you to make sure that you show up, as opposed to a pure independent who maybe is 10, 15% of the electorate they may, or better yet, probably won't show up. And if they do, I could go either way. Well, why would I invest in somebody if I'm not sure that they're a reliable vote for myself or my candidate, instead of focusing on that person that, yeah, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and by God, I'm going to vote for my party. Put the money there, forget about the folks in the middle. The problem then becomes, do the extremes carry the weight, and the middle where you get compromise is diminished? And I think that's what we're facing in this country right now.
And staying with regard to just kind of the voting process, I wanted to specifically ask about this year, because I personally am not very familiar with Fourth Circuit's ruling.
Okay.
I understand what
Yep.
it was about and
Yep.
what voter ID laws kind
Yep.
of were, but can you just kind of give me like a general timeline of what happened in terms of, I've heard from so many sides, these are Republican-led efforts to suppress the vote. Was that an actual thing or what?
Okay. I think, again, we've got to go back to 2008 and Obama's use of things like early voting, and in particularly minority voters. He won. If you look at early votes, he won before Election Day. It was on Election Day that Republicans decided to show up and really make the state competitive. Okay? Republicans didn't know what hit them until it was too late. And what I think happened is in 2010, when Republicans took over control of the state, they said, okay, if Obama used the rules of the game to his advantage, we'll just basically rewrite the rules to our advantage. And so they compressed early voter turnout in terms of early voting. They kept the same number of hours, but they cut the number of days in counties. They instituted voter ID. They instituted things like doing away with same-day registration. If you weren't registered, you could show up during early voting, ask to register, and cast a ballot. And that was seen as a democratic tool in terms of getting voters out and getting them to vote. So they passed all of these rules and changes in the election law. And after the Supreme Court made a pretty important decision, they then passed all these rules changes into law, and it got challenged. And what ultimately the Fourth Circuit looked at was the fact that the Republicans in the legislature asked for some data. How many black voters use early voting? How many of them used same-day registration? How many of them have driver's licenses? They asked for all this data before they constructed the law, and the judges looked at that and said, aha, there's racial intent. You asked for all this information and then crafted changes in the law that were detrimental, perceived, against minority voters. And so that's kind of where we are right now in terms of the legal challenges. Now, ultimately, it's going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But for right now, everything reverts back to before the Republicans took control. And basically, we're back in 2008 kind of territory.
So Fourth Circuit says this is
Unconstitutional, right.
Unconstitutional.
Yeah.
I forget the phrase, but blatantly
Discriminatory.
Blatantly discriminatory. And then Governor McCrory says we're going to appeal to the state Supreme Court. State Supreme Court deadlock, lower court ruling stands. So with that lower court's ruling standing, what's changed since then from the old practices? Because now you can vote on the same day. Am I correct? Like you can register.
You can do same-day registration. You can do out-of-precinct voting. The provisional voting, the voter ID is done away with, and the early voting goes back to the more full range of days, not necessarily the hours. And so basically everything kind of reverts back to 2008 when the law was not changed by the Republicans.
So what's the impact for Republicans then? Or is it at
Well,
this their chances going forward now?
No, because, the way that I look at it, both sides have the same capabilities. Here are the rules of the game. You can do this, you can motivate your voters to show up, you can use early voting. Both sides have this capability open to them. The question is, who's going to take advantage of it? Who's going to work to make sure that these things work to their advantage? And I think Republicans looked at it as an opportunity to kind of say, we're going to recreate or restructure things to our advantage, but they have the same opportunity as Democrats to get their voters to show up, to same-day register. It's all there for the taking if your party wants to take advantage of it. And that's the thing that I think Republicans oftentimes don't realize is we can play the same game as Democrats do, we just got to put forward the effort.
Sorry for that.
Ooh, 6 o'clock. Okay.
Just had a final for you.
Yeah, that's right.
I think we're good. There we go.
Oh no, we go through the Big Ben chime, so we got to do 6 bells here after our little tune. So
It goes for about 1.5 to 2 minutes.
well, at noon we get the noon hour with the 12 bells, and then I think at 5 after they programmed it to do a little song, and then at I think it's 12:15 it does the alma mater. So it's like you're teaching a Tuesday, Thursday noon class, particularly in this building or in the science building. It's like, okay, we're just gonna ignore the bells and keep going. So okay.
So specifically with the kind of the data that the state leadership or Republican leadership requested, what was the timeline for that in terms of them requesting it and who requested it?
It was my understanding that the legislative leaders in the Republican caucuses asked for that data. Now,
When was that?
whether that would have been in 2011.
Oh wow. Okay.
Okay, so they won the 2010 election in the Tea Party insurgency. They took control of the state legislature in 2011, and this legislation came out in July of 2011 after the Supreme Court handed down a pretty big ruling that,
U.S. Supreme Court.
yes, U.S. Supreme Court.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then final question for the registration aspect is,
Yeah.
Republicans and some leaders, the thing I've heard more than anything is we just want to make sure you are who you say we are. We don't want voter fraud to take place.
Sure.
We don't want any harm to be done. But
Yep.
the reality is voter fraud is
Non-existent.
practical. It is
It-
really. I mean,
yeah.
like 60 cases or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you just speak to that claim that voter fraud is the reason we instituted this policy?
Well, I think for a lot of Republicans that I've talked to about this particular issue, they always say, well, I heard that Johnny Sue's cousin was able to cast a ballot in this county and then he drove across the state and voted in this county. And that's anecdotal. That was already a crime to begin with. And if they knew about that, they should have reported it. Now, the willingness to acknowledge that voter fraud is a minuscule fraction of the totality of all the votes cast in the United States is a sense of that's what's driving Republicans. Now, I think certainly we want people to be the ones who are legally casting votes. I don't think anybody could argue with that. The question becomes, how much of a hurdle will you put on certain demographic groups that either dissuade or are not allowed to cast ballots with the kind of stringent requirements that the Republicans first put on. Basically, it was you had to have a state or a federal document with a picture on it in order to cast a ballot. North Carolina's law at the time it was passed was considered among the most stringent laws regarding voter ID. What they subsequently did was go back and say, well, okay, you can, if you don't have it, you can use other forms of identification, or you can testify that you weren't able to get a document or a photo ID, and we'll still let you vote. So it basically just completely watered down the argument that they were making of, you got to have a photo ID, well, now maybe not so much kind of thing. You know, I hear the issue constantly about, you know, we're protecting the sanctity of the ballot box. That's a great thing. But you know what? I could request by mail a ballot for my wife and sign her name to it and not have to provide any verification of that I'm Andrea Anders, and be able to cast a ballot that way. They didn't do anything about the mail-in ballot system that is potentially open to mischief. They just did it for the in-person voting process. And I think that's where a lot of the controversy is.
So minorities are more likely to vote in state, or certain groups that might traditionally be
Vote
Democratic.
Democratic, exactly. So African American voters,
Gotcha.
Native American voters, older voters, younger voters. You know, there may be a need that a younger voter living in an urban area uses public transportation, doesn't necessarily need a driver's license. So that's the dynamic that they were working on.
And just two final parts.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to
Sure.
forgive me.
Not a problem.
I'll send a very nice thank you.
It's quite all right.
Promise.
Quite all right.
So I kind of want to focus on the strategies for the campaigns and
Sure.
the candidates right now, because
That's half the
what
fun.
a lot of people
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know.
Yep.
So first, Senate, what is the strategy for Burr, and what is the strategy for Ross? In order, what do they need to do in these last few weeks to put themselves in a good position to win? Because they're probably the most neck and neck out of anyone.
Well, I would contend that all three of the big races in North Carolina, presidential, gubernatorial,
Statistical
U.S.
time polls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were all within the margin of error. So,
Absolutely.
so it's basically a
Same
coin
vote,
toss.
yeah.
The two that have attracted the most attention have been the presidential and the gubernatorial race. The U.S. Senate race has basically flown under the radar. And I think what we're starting to see with this last month's push are these new ads that Senator Burr and a super PAC that's supporting him and Deborah Ross have come out with of basically starting the attack ads. They have to break through the noise of the Clinton-Trump and the McCrory-Cooper race. And the way to do that is to basically scare people, fear, anger, antagonism. That's what's going to attract attention. You know, if you're showing puppies, you know, running in a lawn and, you know, people enjoying themselves and smiling, that's not going to motivate somebody. If you scare somebody or you try and terrify them or energize them that way, that's really the way that you can kind of break through that noise. And I think the Burr-Ross race, by all accounts, this should be a lean Republican seat. The question is, what is the top of the ticket going to have the impact on this race and maybe the governor's race as well? The three races should interlock with each other, and it seems like they're all kind of going their own separate paths. And that could be an interesting November, to say the least, in this state.
And I think going up to the gubernatorial race with Roy Cooper, I just have not seen him really active on the campaign trail. It seems the strategy has been, let's let McCrory talk and have HB2 and dig his own grave.
I think that is a very conscientious decision that I think the Cooper campaign has made, not just with HB2, but with a lot of things. But HB2 has really kind of driven this entire campaign. And I think realistically, if McCrory could have tried to prevent HB2 from going into effect, he would have done everything he could. But I think he's being driven by his party in the legislature that is much more conservative than where he sees himself. And he is making a decision, do I try and go for the middle or do I go for my base? And this is a base year election that people in rural areas, the base of the Republican Party, wants this kind of legislation like HB2. They don't care what the urban areas do as long as they get penalized. McCrory was mayor of the city of Charlotte. Well, between HB2, between the state trying to take over the Charlotte Douglas Airport, and then in the northern part of Mecklenburg County, the I-77 toll roads, which everybody hates in that part and is a very strong Republican area, he's looking at his home county and saying, am I even going to win there, potentially? And I think that's the big strategy from his point of view. But Cooper is basically, his strategy is let everything bad happen to McCrory and I can just kind of stand there and not have to deal with it. I think that now that's going to get, as we get closer to November, he's going to have to become engaged in it. And I think the debates and things like that will really drive it. But,
well, not the debates, the debate.
The debate, yes, the debate, yes.
And finally, presidential level, I know we talked about it in the past. For Clinton, it seems I looked at some of her past rallies, and since the general election, it's only been Greensboro, it's only been Raleigh, and it's only been Charlotte.
Yep.
She's visited some of those several times, like Charlotte.
Yep.
But she ain't going anywhere else.
Guess where the Democratic base is?
Exactly.
In urban areas.
So,
yeah.
Is it just let's write off the rest of the state? I understand kind of the need to appeal to your base, but is there not a fear that you're missing other suburbs and other segments?
Well, but if you hit those urban areas, and those areas are where the media market is, you can get translated out into the suburbs and even into the rural areas. But I think for the Clinton campaign, it's about elevating the urban base. But if she can get suburban areas that maybe are more moderate in tone, particularly Republican tone, if she can drop that 62-38 to maybe 60-40, maybe 58-42, decrease the Republican buildup in the suburban areas, she can be competitive in this state. And I think what she's doing is laying the foundation of Donald Trump is too scary for a moderate Republican, white, suburban mom to even think about voting for. And if you look at her ads, that's the kind of targeted audience I think she's really going after. So in this state, the battle, I think, is going to be in the suburbs for those moderate Republicans that traditionally vote very Republican, but now are like, I just don't know about this top of the ticket race.
Even if you don't vote Clinton, if you just don't show up.
Well, that's another advantage to basically Hillary Clinton's campaign. Yeah.
And for Donald Trump, he's been everywhere. Kenansville population,
Yep.
852.
Yep.
If you can think of it, he's probably been a little bit of every part of the entire state. What's the strategy for him?
If Donald Trump does not win North Carolina, I don't see a path through the Electoral College that he gets to 270. It's that simple. For Hillary Clinton, North Carolina is icing on the cake if she wins. For Donald Trump, he has to have North Carolina. He has to have Pennsylvania. He's got to have Ohio. He's got to have Florida. He has a much harder mountain to climb in the Electoral College than Hillary Clinton does, just simply because of the dynamics and the demographics in all of these states that lean already towards the Democrat having a stronger base in the Electoral College than the Republicans do right now.
And finally, Catawba's a very small college.
Yep.
Elon's a very small college.
Yep.
Looking at vice presidential debate, it's going to be at a very small
Yeah,
Longwood.
Longwood, yeah.
Where do you kind of see the role of these smaller institutions in the political process?
I think for any institution of higher education, but particularly for smaller oriented institutions, not big public ones, but I think students have the opportunity to interact on a daily basis with their faculty. And no matter what the political persuasion of the faculty member is, I think all faculty want students to be critical thinkers, to be analytical problem solvers, to be willing to invest in ideas that may challenge them, their perspective, and be willing to acknowledge the other side, whether you agree with it or not. And so I think that daily interaction gives us as faculty the opportunity to say to students, well, what do you think about some of these issues that these candidates are talking about? And have that kind of dialogue and discussion that hopefully they'll say, yeah, okay, I care passionately or interested in this particular policy issue, I need to go vote. And I think that's where small, medium-sized institutions of higher education really benefit the civic discourse that we need.
And after looking at this issue, I've done public voter searches on members of Elon's administration, and there's 9 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 4 unaffiliated, and they're fairly 2 independents. One leans Republican, one leans Democrat. But it seems that lots of just college administrations just generally aren't that diverse. I want to say in terms of just there's still a lot of progress in bringing more diversity to the workplace.
Sure.
But it seems there's still not as much diversity in administrations reflective of a general population.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think more and more institutions of higher education are becoming diverse, and you have to remember administrators generally come from the base client, and that's the faculty. And it's hard to get minorities into higher education because it generally takes longer, it's more expensive. But it's a growing sense of the academy becoming more reflective of our society as a whole. Now, how administrators are received and how their political persuasions come through. I'm a registered unaffiliated voter. My students don't know who I vote for. I don't tell my wife. So if I'm not telling her, I'm not even going to think about telling my students. And I tend to run my classes as a devil's advocate. Yes, you may believe in what you believe, and you may believe very firmly in that. But I'm going to challenge you to substantiate that belief system and to hear from the other side. You don't have to agree with it, but recognize that there is a different viewpoint. And if folks can understand where that different viewpoint is coming from, maybe we'll have a whole lot less yelling in terms of partisan rhetoric and a whole lot more listening and saying, you know what, there are some points I do agree with you. Not everything, but I'm going to be willing to compromise. That's what I think we're missing nowadays.
And the last thing that I was trying to try and get at is that I've heard, talking with our university provost, that there's an informal policy that administrators should not vocalize their political, high-level administrators shouldn't vocalize their political beliefs for fear that it can reflect on the university
institution. Sure.
itself. Is that anything unusual?
No, and I think that is part of the deal that faculty assume when it comes to things like academic freedom. Academic freedom means you have the right to explore your discipline, how you choose to do so, and acknowledge that others have the right to challenge your views in that particular discipline. Now, for an administrator, you know, it's oftentimes you're trying to balance the competing demands and needs for resources from across the institution. So you have to be the representative of the entire institution now, not just your singular discipline. And I think for folks in those kinds of administrative roles, they are seen as the embodiment of the institution. And they have to be aware that the words that they use in public do reflect on the institution as a whole. And it's important to say, when you're speaking, I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the institution in terms of making that very clear delineation when it comes to things outside of their disciplinary control. I'm a political scientist. I study American politics. I study Southern politics. I study North Carolina politics. I'm able to do things like this to say, this is my area of expertise. These are the facts and the data that I have. Now, if I was to talk about, I don't know, nursing or, biology or, business administration or athletic training, I don't have the expertise or the credentials to do that. But I hope that I would be able to reflect my institution's philosophy.
And final one.
Yep.
What is, for people, I know many people hate even politics, hearing about it from the start.
Sure.
Regardless of what you think, what is one thing any student should be aware of in this political season? What do they need to know?
The one thing that every student and every citizen needs to know is whether they like it or not, government is going to have some impact on their daily life. And if they're not willing to participate in the decision-making process to understand and have some voice in that impact on them on a daily status or a daily occurrence, then we need to give up our democratic republic, small d, small r, because we, the people, have the power. And whether you want to acknowledge it or not, ultimately it comes from us. And I always challenge my students in Intro to American Politics. I ask them, if you can name one activity that you do on a daily basis that government doesn't have some impact on, I'll give you $20. I've been teaching since 1998. I haven't given out $20 yet.